Chapter 12 of The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 12. Astronomy, and a watchman looking at half a dozen lanterns where a street's been torn up. There are gas lights and kerosene lamps and electric lights in the neighborhood, matches flaring, fires in stoves, bonfires, house afire somewhere, lights of automobiles, illuminated signs, the watchman and his one little system, ethics, and some young ladies, and the dear old professor of a very select seminary. Drugs and divorce and rape, venereal diseases, drunkenness, murder, excluded. The prim and the precise, or the exact, the homogeneous, the single, the puritanic, the mathematic, the pure, the perfect. We can have illusion of this state, but only by disregarding its infinite denials. It's a drop of milk afloat in acid that's eating it. The positive swamped by the negative. So it is in intermediateness, where only to be positive is to generate corresponding and, perhaps, equal negativeness. In our acceptance, it is, in quasi-existence, premonitory, or prenatal, or pre-awakening consciousness of a real existence. But this consciousness of realness is the greatest resistance to efforts to realize or to become real, because it is feeling that realness has been attained. Our antagonism is not to science, but to the attitude of the sciences that they have finally realized, or to belief, instead of acceptance, to the insufficiency, which, as we have seen over and over, amounts to paltriness and puerility of scientific dogmas and standards. Or if several persons start out to Chicago and get to Buffalo, and one be under the delusion that Buffalo is Chicago, that one will be a resistance to the progress of the others. So astronomy and its seemingly exact little system. But data we shall have of round worlds and spindle-shaped worlds and worlds shaped like a wheel, worlds like titanic pruning hooks, worlds linked together by streaming filaments, solitary worlds and worlds in hordes, tremendous worlds and tiny worlds, some of them made of material like the material of this earth, and worlds that are geometric, superconstructions made of iron and steel. Or not only fall from the sky of ashes and cinders and coke and charcoal and oily substances that suggest fuel, but the masses of iron that have fallen upon this earth. Wrecks and flotsam and fragments of vast iron constructions. Or steel. Sooner or later we shall have to take up an expression that fragments of steel have fallen from the sky. If fragments not of iron, but of steel have fallen upon this earth. But what would a deep-sea fish learn, even if a steel plate of a wrecked vessel above him should drop and bump him on the nose? Our submergence in a sea of conventionality, of almost impenetrable density. Sometimes I'm a savage who has found something on the beach of his island. Sometimes I'm a deep-sea fish with a sore nose. The greatest of mysteries. Why don't they ever come here or send here openly? Of course, there's nothing to that mystery if we don't take so seriously the notion that we must be interesting. It's probably for moral reasons that they stay away. But even so, there must be some degraded ones among them. Or physical reasons. When we can specially take up that subject, one of our leading ideas, or credulities, will be that near approach by another world to this world would be catastrophic, that navigable worlds would avoid proximity, that others that have survived have organized into protective remotenesses, or orbits which approximate to regularity, though by no means to the degree of popular supposition. But the persistence of the notion that we must be interesting, bugs and germs and things like that, they're interesting to us. Some of them are too interesting. Dangers of near approach. Nevertheless, our own ships that dare not venture close to a rocky shore can send rowboats ashore. Why not diplomatic relations established between the United States and Cyclorea, which in our advanced astronomy is the name of a remarkable wheel-shaped world or superconstruction? Why not missionaries sent here openly to convert us from our barbarous prohibitions and other taboos, and to prepare the way for a good trade in ultra-Bibles and super-whiskeys, fortunes made in selling us cast-off super-fineries, which we'd take to like an African chief to someone's old silk hat from New York or London? The answer that occurs to me is so simple that it seems immediately acceptable, if we accept that the obvious is the solution of all problems, or if most of our perplexities consist in laboriously and painfully conceiving of the unanswerable, and then looking for answers, using such words as obvious and solution conventionally. Or would we, if we could, educate and sophisticate pigs, geese, cattle? Would it be wise to establish diplomatic relations with the hen that now functions, satisfied with mere sense of achievement by way of compensation? I think we're property. I should say we belong to something. That once upon a time this earth was no man's land, that other worlds explored and colonized here and fought among themselves for possessions, but that now it's owned by something. That something owns this earth, all others warned off. Nothing in our own times, perhaps, because I am thinking of certain notes I have, has ever appeared upon this earth from somewhere else, so openly as Columbus landed upon San Salvador, or as Hudson sailed up his river, but as to surreptitious visits to this earth in recent times, or as to emissaries, perhaps from other worlds, or voyagers who have shown every indication of intent to evade and avoid, we shall have data as convincing as our data of oil or coal burning aerial superconstructions. But in this vast subject I shall have to do considerable neglecting or disregarding myself. I don't see how I can, in this book, take up at all the subject of possible use of humanity to some other mode of existence, or the flattering notion that we can possibly be worth something. Pigs, geese, and cattle. First find out that they are owned. Then find out the whyness of it. I suspect that, after all, we're useful, that among contesting claimants adjustment has occurred, or that something now has a legal right to us by force, or by having paid out analogues of beads for us to former, more primitive owners of us, all others warned off, that all this has been known, perhaps for ages, to certain ones upon this earth, a cult or order, members of which function like bellwethers to the rest of us, or as superior slaves or overseers, directing us in accordance with instructions received from somewhere else in our mysterious usefulness. But I accept that in the past, before proprietorship was established, inhabitants of a host of other worlds have dropped here, hopped here, wafted, sailed, flown, motored, walked here, for all I know, been pulled here, been pushed, have come singly, have come in enormous numbers, have visited occasionally, have visited periodically for hunting, trading, replenishing harems, mining, have been unable to stay here, have established colonies here, have been lost here, far advanced peoples, or things, and primitive peoples, or whatever they were, white ones, black ones, yellow ones. I have a very convincing datum that the ancient Britons were the blue ones. Of course, we are told by conventional anthropologists that they only painted themselves blue, but in our own advanced anthropology, they were veritable blue ones. Annals of Philosophy, 1451. Note of a blue child born in England. That's atavism. Giants and fairies. We accept them, of course, or if we pride ourselves upon being awfully far advanced, I don't know how to sustain our conceit except by very largely going far back. Science of today, the superstition of tomorrow. Science of tomorrow, the superstition of today. Notice of a stone axe, 17 inches long, 9 inches across, broad end. Proceedings, Society of Antiquities of Scotland, 19184. American Antiquarian, 1860. Copper axe from an Ohio mound, 22 inches long, weight 38 pounds. American Anthropologist, NS, 8229. Stone axe found at Birchwood, Wisconsin, exhibited in the collection of the Missouri Historical Society, found with the pointed end embedded in the soil. For all I know, may have dropped there. 28 inches long, 14 wide, 11 thick. Weight 300 pounds. Or the footprints in sandstone near Carson, Nevada, each print 18 to 20 inches long. American Journal of Science, 3/26/139. These footprints are very clear and well defined reproduction of them in the journal, but they assimilate with the system, like sour apples, to other systems. So Professor Marsh, a loyal and unscrupulous systematist, argues, quote, "The size of these footprints, and specially the width between the right and left series, are strong evidence that they were not made by men, as has been so generally supposed." End quote. So these excluders, stranglers of Minerva, desperados of disregard, above all, or below all, the anthropologists. I'm inspired with a new insult. Someone offends me. I wish to express almost absolute contempt for him. He's a systematistic anthropologist. Simply to read something of this kind is not so impressive as to see for one's self, if anyone will take the trouble to look up these footprints as pictured in the journal. He will either agree with Professor Marsh, or feel that to deny them is to indicate a mind as profoundly enslaved by a system as was ever the humble intellect of a medieval monk. The reasoning of this representative phantom of the chosen, or of the special appearances who sit in judgment or condemnation upon us of the more nearly real. That there never were giants upon this earth, because gigantic footprints are more gigantic than prints made by men who are not giants. We think of giants as occasional visitors to this earth. Of course, Stonehenge, for instance. It may be that, as time goes on, we shall have to admit that there are remains of many tremendous habitations of giants upon this earth, and that their appearances here were more than casual, but their bones, or the absence of their bones, except that no matter how cheerful and unsuspicious my disposition may be, when I go to the American Museum of Natural History, dark cynicisms arise the moment I come to the fossils, or old bones that have been found upon this earth, gigantic things, that have been reconstructed into terrifying but proper dinosaurs. But my uncheerfulness. The dodo did it. On one of the floors below the fossils, they have a reconstructed dodo. It's frankly a fiction. It's labeled as such. But it's been reconstructed so cleverly and so convincingly. Fairies. Fairy crosses. Harper's Weekly, 5715. That, near the point where the Blue Ridge and the Allegheny Mountains unite, north of Patrick County, Virginia, many little stone crosses have been found. A race of tiny beings. They crucified cockroaches. Exquisite beings, but the cruelty of the exquisite. In their diminutive way, they were human beings. They crucified. The fairy crosses, we are told in Harper's Weekly, range in weight from 1/4 of an ounce to an ounce, but it is said in the Scientific American that some of them are no larger than the head of a pin. They've been found in 2 other states, but all in Virginia are strictly localized on and along Bull Mountain. We are reminded of the Chinese seals in Ireland. I suppose they fell there. Some are Roman crosses, some St. Andrews, some Maltese. This time we are spared contact with the anthropologists and have geologists instead. But I am afraid that the relief to our finer or more nearly real sensibilities will not be very great. The geologists were called upon to explain the fairy crosses. Their response was the usual scientific tropism. Geologists say that they are crystals. The writer in Harper's Weekly points out that this holds up, or this anesthetic, if theoretic science be little but attempt to assuage pangs of the unexplained, fails to account for the localized distributions of these objects, which makes me think of both aggregation and separation at the bottom of the sea, if from a wrecked ship similar objects should fall in large numbers, but at different times. But some are Roman crosses, some St. Andrews, some Maltese. Conceivably, there might be a mineral that would have a diversity of geometric forms, at the same time restricted to some expression of the cross, because snowflakes, for instance, have diversity but restriction to the hexagon. But the guilty geologists, cold-blooded as astronomers and chemists and all the other deep-sea fishes, though less profoundly of the pseudo-saved than the wretched anthropologists, disregarded the very datum that it was wise to disregard: that the fairy crosses are not all made of the same material. It's the same old disregard, or it's the same old psychotropism, or process of assimilation. Crystals are geometric forms. Crystals are included in the system. So then fairy crosses are crystals, but that different minerals should, in a few different regions, be inspired to turn into different forms of the cross is the kind of resistance that we call less nearly real than our own acceptances. We now come to some cursed little things that are of the lost, but for the salvation of which scientific missionaries have done their damnedest. Pygmy flints. They can't very well be denied. They're lost and well known. Pygmy flints are tiny prehistoric implements. Some of them are 1/4 of an inch in size. England, India, France, South Africa, they've been found in many parts of the world, whether showered there or not. They belong high up in the froth of the accursed. They are not denied, and they've not been disregarded. There's an abundant literature upon this subject. One attempt to rationalize them, or assimilate them, or take them into the scientific fold, has been the notion that they were toys of prehistoric children. It sounds reasonable, but, of course, by the reasonable, we mean that for which the equally reasonable, but opposing, has not been found out, except that we modify that by saying that, though nothing's finally reasonable, some phenomena have higher approximations to reasonableness than have others. Against the notion of toys, the higher approximation is that where pygmy flints are found, all flints are pygmies, at least so in India, where, when larger implements have been found in the same place, there are separations by strata. Wilson. The datum that, just at present, leads me to accept that these flints were made by beings about the size of pickles is a point brought about by Professor Wilson. This is in the report of the National Museum, 1892, 455. Not only that the flints are tiny, but that the chipping upon them is minute. Struggle for expression, in the mind of a 19th centuryite, of an idea that did not belong to his era. In Science Gossip, 1896, 36, R.A. Galty says, "So fine is the chipping that to see the workmanship a magnifying glass is necessary." End quote. I think that would be absolutely convincing if there were anything, absolutely anything, either that tiny beings from pickle to cucumber stature made these things, or that ordinary savages made them under magnifying glasses. The idea that we are now going to develop, or perpetrate, is rather intensely of the accursed, or the advanced. It's a lost soul, I admit, or boast, but it fits in. Or, as conventional as ever, our own method is the scientific method of assimilating. It assimilates if we think of the inhabitants of Elvera. By the way, I forgot to tell the name of the giant's world. Monstrator. Spindle-shaped world, about 100,000 miles along its major axis. More details to be published later. But our coming inspiration fits in if we think of the inhabitants of Elvera as having only visited here, having, in hordes as dense as clouds of bats, come here upon hunting excursions. For mice, I should say, for bees very likely, or, most likely of all, or inevitably, to convert the heathen here, horrified with anyone who would gorge himself with more than a bean at a time, fearful for the souls of beings who would guzzle more than a dewdrop at a time, hordes of tiny missionaries determined that right should prevail, determining right by their own minutenesses. They must have been missionaries. Only to be is motion, to convert or assimilate something else. The idea now is that tiny creatures, coming here from their own little world, which may be Eros, though I call it Elvera, would flit from the exquisite to the enormous, gulp of a fair-sized terrestrial animal, half a dozen of them gone and soon digested. One falls into a brook, torn away in a mighty torrent. Or never anything but conventional we adopt from Darwin. Quote, "The geological records are incomplete." End quote. Their flints would survive, but as to their fragile bodies, one might as well search for prehistoric frost traceries. A little whirlwind, Elverian, carried away 100 yards, body never found by his companions. They'd mourn for the departed, conventional emotion to have, they'd mourn. There'd have to be a funeral. There's no getting away from funerals. So I adopt an explanation that I take from the anthropologists. Burial in effigy. Perhaps the Elverians would not come to this earth again until many years later. Another distressing occurrence. One little mausoleum for all burials in effigy. London Times, July 20th, 1836. That, early in July 1836, some boys were searching for rabbits' burrows in the rocky formations near Edinburgh, known as Arthur's Seat. In the side of a cliff they came upon some thin sheets of slate, which they pulled out. Little cave. 17 tiny coffins, 3 or 4 inches long. In the coffins were miniature wooden figures. They were dressed differently, both in style and material. There were 2 tiers of 8 coffins each, and a 3rd tier begun with 1 coffin. The extraordinary datum, which has especially made mystery here, that the coffins had been deposited singly in the little cave and at intervals of many years. In the first tier the coffins were quite decayed, and the wrappings had mouldered away. In the second tier the effects of age had not advanced so far, and the top coffin was quite recent looking. In the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquarians of Scotland, 3/12/460, there is a full account of this find. 3 of the coffins and 3 of the figures are pictured. So Elvera, with its downy forests and its microscopic oyster shells, and if the Elverians be not very far advanced, they take baths with sponges the size of pinheads, or that catastrophes have occurred, that fragments of Elvera have fallen to this earth. In Popular Science, 2083, Francis Bingham, writing of the corals and sponges and shells and crinoids that Dr. Hahn had asserted that he had found in meteorites, says, judging by the photographs of them, that their notable peculiarity is their extreme smallness. The corals, for instance, are about 1/20th the size of terrestrial corals. They represent a veritable pygmy animal world, says Bingham. The inhabitants of Monstrator and Elvera were primitives, I think, at the time of their occasional visits to this earth, though of course in a quasi-existence anything that we semi-phantoms call evidence of anything may be just as good evidence of anything else. Logicians and detectives and jurymen and suspicious wives and members of the Royal Astronomic Society recognize this indeterminateness, but have the delusion that in the method of agreement there is final or real evidence. The method is good enough for an existence that is only semi-real, but also it is the method of reasoning by which witches were burned, and by which ghosts have been feared. I'd not like to be so unadvanced as to deny witches and ghosts, but I do think that there never have been witches and ghosts like those of popular supposition. But stories of them have been supported by astonishing fabrications of details and of different accounts in agreement. So, if a giant left impressions of his bare feet in the ground, that is not to say that he was a primitive, bulk of culture out taking the Knipe cure. So if Stonehenge is a large but only roughly geometric construction, the inattention to details by its builders signifies anything you please, ambitious dwarfs or giants, if giants, that they were little more than cavemen, or they were post-impressionist architects from a very far advanced civilization. If there are other worlds, there are tutelary worlds, or that Kepler, for instance, could not have been absolutely wrong, that his notion of an angel assigned to push along and guide each planet may not be very acceptable, but that abstractedly, or in the notion of a tutelary relation, we may find acceptance. Only to be is to be tutelary. Our general expression that everything in intermediateness is not a thing, but is an endeavor to become something, by breaking away from its continuity, or merging away with all other phenomena, is an attempt to break away from the very essence of a relative existence, and become absolute, if it have not surrendered to, or become part of, some higher attempt. That to this process there are two aspects: attraction, or the spirit of everything to assimilate all other things, if it have not given in and subordinated to, or have not been assimilated by, some higher attempted system, unity, organization, entity, harmony, equilibrium; and repulsion, or the attempt of everything to exclude or disregard the unassimilable. Universality of the process. Anything conceivable. A tree, it is doing all it can to assimilate substances of the soil and substances of the air, and sunshine too, into tree substance. Obversely, it is rejecting or excluding or disregarding that which it cannot assimilate. Cow grazing, pig roosting, tiger stalking, planets trying or acting to capture comets, rag pickers and the Christian religion, and a cat down headfirst in a garbage can, nations fighting for more territory, sciences correlating the data they can, trust magnates organizing, chorus girl out for a little late supper. All of them stopped somewhere by the unassimilable. Chorus girl and the broiled lobster, if she eats not shell, and all she represents, universal failure to positivize. Also, if she does, she represents universal failure to positivize her ensuing disorders, will translate her to the negative absolute. Or science and some of our cursed hard-shelled data. One speaks of the tutelarian as if it were something distinct in itself. So one speaks of a tree, a saint, a barrel of pork, the Rocky Mountains. One speaks of missionaries as if they were positively different, or had identity of their own, or were a species by themselves. To the intermediatist, everything that seems to have identity is only attempted identity, and every species is continuous with all other species, or that which is called the specific is only emphasis upon some aspect of the general. If there are cats, their only emphasis upon universal felinity. There is nothing that does not partake of that of which the missionary or the tutelary is the special. Every conversation is a conflict of missionaries, each trying to convert the other, to assimilate, or to make the other similar to himself. If no progress be made, mutual repulsion will follow. If other worlds have ever in the past had relations with this earth, they were attempted positivizations to extend themselves by colonies upon this earth, to convert or assimilate indigenous inhabitants of this earth, or parent worlds and their colonies here. Super-Romanimus, or where the first Romans came from. It's as good as the Romulus and Remus story. Super-Israelimus, or that, despite modern reasoning upon this subject, there was once something that was super-parental or tutelary to early Orientals. Azuria, which was tutelary to the early Britons. Azuria, whence came the blue Britons, whose descendants gradually diluting, like bluing, in a washtub where a faucet's turned on, have been most emphasized of subtutelarians, or assimilations, ever since. Worlds that were once tutelarian worlds, before this earth became sole property of one of them, their attempts to convert or assimilate, but then the state that comes to all things in their missionary frustrations, unacceptance by all stomachs of some things, rejection by all societies of some units, glaciers that sort over and cast out stones, repulsion, wrath of the baffled missionary. There is no other wrath. All repulsion is reaction to the unassimilable. So then the wrath of Azuria, because surrounding peoples of this earth would not assimilate with her own colonists in the part of the earth that we now call England. I don't know that there has ever been more nearly just, reasonable, or logical wrath in this earth's history, if there is no other wrath. The wrath of Azuria, because the other peoples of this earth would not turn blue to suit her. History is a department of human delusion that interests us. We are able to give a little advancement to history. In the vitrified forts of a few parts of Europe, we find data that the Humes and Gibbons have disregarded. The vitrified forts surrounding England, but not in England. The vitrified forts of Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Bohemia. Or that, once upon a time, with electric blasts, Azuria tried to swipe the earth clear of the peoples who resisted her. The vast blue bulk of Azuria appeared in the sky. Clouds turned green. The sun was formless and purple in the vibrations of wrath that were emanating from Azuria. The whitish, or yellowish, or brownish peoples of Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Bohemia fled to hilltops and built forts. In a real existence, hilltops, or easiest accessibility to an aerial enemy, would be the last choice in refuges. But here, in quasi-existence, if we're accustomed to run to hilltops in times of danger, we run to them just the same, even with danger closest to hilltops. Very common in quasi-existence, attempt to escape by running closer to the pursuing. They built forts, or already had forts, on hilltops. Something poured electricity upon them. The stones of these forts exist to this day, vitrified, or melted and turned to glass. The archaeologists have jumped from one conclusion to another, like the rapid chamois we read of a while ago, to account for vitrified forts, always restricted by the commandment that unless their conclusions conformed to such tenets as exclusionism of the system, they would be excommunicated. So archaeologists, in their medieval dread of excommunication, have tried to explain vitrified forts in terms of terrestrial experience. We find in their insufficiencies the same old assimilating of all that could be assimilated, and disregard for the unassimilable, conventionalizing into the explanation that vitrified forts were made by prehistoric peoples who built vast fires, often remote from wood supply, to melt externally and to cement together the stones of their constructions. But negativeness always, so within itself, a science can never be homogeneous or unified or harmonious. So Miss Russell, in the Journal of the BAA, has pointed out that it is seldom that single stones to say nothing of long walls of large houses that are burned to the ground, are vitrified. If we pay a little attention to this subject ourselves before starting to write upon it, which is one of the ways of being more nearly real than oppositions so far encountered by us, we find that the stones of these forts are vitrified in no reference to cementing them. They are cemented here and there in streaks, as if special blasts had struck or played upon them. Then one thinks of lightning? Once upon a time something melted, in streaks, the stones of forts on the tops of hills in Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Bohemia. Lightning selects the isolated and conspicuous. But some of the vitrified forts are not on top of hills. Some are very inconspicuous. Their walls, too, are vitrified in streaks. Something once had effect similar to lightning upon forts, mostly on hills in Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Bohemia. But upon hills all over the rest of the world are remains of forts that are not vitrified. There is only one crime in the local sense, and that is not to turn blue, if the gods are blue. But in the universal sense, the one crime is not to turn the gods themselves green, if you're green. End of chapter 12. Recording by Patrick McAfee, Chicago, gis.depaul.edu/pmcAfee. Chapter 13 of The Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick McAfee. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort, Chapter 13. One of the most extraordinary of phenomena, or alleged phenomena, of psychic research, or alleged research, if in quasi-existence there never has been real research, but only approximations to research that merge away, or that are continuous with, prejudice and convenience. Stone throwing. It's attributed to poltergeists. They're mischievous spirits. Poltergeists do not assimilate with our own present quasi-system, which is an attempt to correlate denied or disregarded data as phenomena of extratelluric forces expressed in physical terms. Therefore, I regard poltergeists as evil or false or discordant or absurd, names that we give to various degrees or aspects of the unassimilable, or that which resists attempts to organize, harmonize, systematize, or in short, to positivize, names that we give to our recognitions of the negative state. I don't care to deny poltergeists, because I suspect that later, when we're more enlightened, or when we widen the range of our credulities, or take on more of that increase of ignorance that is called knowledge, poltergeists may become assimilable. Then they'll be as reasonable as trees. By reasonableness, I mean that which assimilates with a dominant force or system, or a major body of thought, which is itself, of course, hypnosis and delusion, developing, however, in our acceptance to higher and higher approximations to realness. The poltergeists are now evil or absurd to me, proportionately to their present unassimilableness, compounded, however, with the factor of their possible future assimilableness. We lug in the poltergeists because some of our own data, or alleged data, merge away indistinguishably with data or alleged data of them. Instances of stones that have been thrown or that have fallen upon a small area from an unseen and undetectable source. London Times, April 27th, 1872. From 4 o'clock Thursday afternoon until 11:30 Thursday night, the houses 56 and 58 Reverdy Road, Bermondsey, were assailed with stones and other missiles coming from an unseen quarter. 2 children were injured, every window broken, and several articles of furniture were destroyed. Although there was a strong body of policemen scattered in the neighborhood, they could not trace the direction whence the stones were thrown. No. Other missiles makes a complication here, but if the expression means tin cans and old shoes, and if we accept that the direction could not be traced because it never occurred to anyone to look upward, why, we've lost a good deal of our provincialism by this time. London Times, September 16th, 1841. That in the home of Mrs. Charton at Sutton Courthouse, Sutton Lane, Chiswick, windows had been broken by some unseen agent. Every attempt to detect the perpetrator failed. The mansion was detached and surrounded by high walls. No other building was near it. The police were called. 2 constables, assisted by members of the household, guarded the house, but the windows continued to be broken both in front and behind the house. Or the floating islands that are often stationary in the Super Sargasso Sea, and atmospheric disturbances that sometimes affect them and bring things down within small areas upon this earth from temporarily stationary sources. Super Sargasso Sea and the beaches of its floating islands, from which I think, or at least accept, pebbles have fallen. Wolverhampton, England, June 1860. Violent storm. Fall of so many little black pebbles that they were cleared away by shoveling. La Salle pour tout, 5/264. Great number of small black stones that fell at Birmingham, England, August 1858. Violent storm, said to be similar to some basalt a few leagues from Birmingham. Report Brit Association, 1864-37. Pebbles described as common water-worn pebbles that fell at Palestine, Texas, July 6, 1888, of a formation not found near Palestine. W.H. Perry, Sergeant, Signal Corps, Monthly Weather Review, July 1888. Round smooth pebbles at Kandahar, 1834. American Journal Science, 1/26/161. A number of stones of peculiar formation and shapes, unknown in this neighborhood, fell in a tornado at Hillsboro, Illinois, May 18, 1883. Monthly Weather Review, May 1883. Pebbles from aerial beaches and terrestrial pebbles as products of whirlwinds so merge in these instances that, though it's interesting to hear of things of peculiar shape that have fallen from the sky, it seems best to pay little attention here, and to find phenomena of the Super Sargasso Sea remote from the merger. To this requirement we have 3 adaptations. Pebbles that fell where no whirlwind to which to attribute them could be learned of. Pebbles which fell in hail so large that incredibly could that hail have been formed in this earth's atmosphere. Pebbles which fell and were, long afterward, followed by more pebbles, as if from some aerial stationary source, in the same place in September 1898 There was a story in a New York newspaper of lightning, or an appearance of luminosity, in Jamaica. Something had struck a tree. Near the tree were found some small pebbles. It was said that the pebbles had fallen from the sky with the lightning, but the insult to orthodoxy was that they were not angular fragments, such as might have been broken from a stony meteorite, but they were water-worn pebbles. In the geographical vagueness of a mainland, the explanation, up from one place and down in another, is always good, and is never overworked, until the instances are massed as they are in this book. But upon this occasion, in the relatively small area of Jamaica, there was no whirlwind findable. However, there in the first place, bobs up. Monthly Weather Review, August 1898, 363. That the government meteorologist had investigated, had reported that a tree had been struck by lightning, and that small water-worn pebbles had been found near the tree, but that similar pebbles could be found all over Jamaica. Monthly Weather Review, September 1915, 446. Professor Fassig gives an account of a fall of hail that occurred in Maryland, June 22, 1915. Hailstones the size of baseballs, not at all uncommon. An interesting but unconfirmed account stated that small pebbles were found at the center of some of the larger hail gathered at Annapolis. The young man who related the story offered to produce the pebbles, but has not done so. A footnote. Since writing this, the author states that he has received some of the pebbles. When a young man produces pebbles, that's as convincing as anything else I've ever heard of, though no more convincing than if, having told of ham sandwiches falling from the sky, he should produce ham sandwiches. If this reluctance be admitted by us, we correlate it with a datum reported by a Weather Bureau observer, signifying that whether the pebbles had been somewhere aloft a long time or not, some of the hailstones that fell with them had been. The datum is that some of these hailstones were composed of from 20 to 25 layers alternately of clear ice and snow ice. In orthodox terms, I argue that a fair-sized hailstone falls from the clouds with velocity sufficient to warm it so that it would not take on even one layer of ice. To put on 20 layers of ice, I conceive of something that had not fallen at all, but had rolled somewhere at a leisurely rate for a long time. We now have a commonplace datum that is familiar in two respects: little symmetric objects of metal that fell at Orenburg, Russia, September 1824. Philosophical Magazine, 4/8/463. A second fall of these objects at Orenburg, Russia, January 25th, 1825. Quarterly Journal of the Royal Institute, 1828, 1/447. I now think of the disk of Tarbes, but when first I came upon these data, I was impressed only with recurrences, because the objects of Orenburg were described as crystals of pyrites or sulfate of iron. I had no notion of metallic objects that might have been shaped or molded by means other than crystallization, until I came to Arago's account of these occurrences. Oeuvres 11/644. Here the analysis gives 70% red oxide of iron and sulfur, and loss by ignition 5%. It seems to me acceptable that iron with considerably less than 5% sulfur in it is not iron pyrites. Then little rusty iron objects, shaped by some other means, have fallen 4 months apart at the same place. Mr. Arago expresses astonishment at this phenomenon of recurrence, so familiar to us. Altogether, I find opening before us vistas of heresies to which I, for one, must shut my eyes. I have always been in sympathy with the dogmatists and exclusionists. That is plain in our opening lines. That to seem to be is falsely and arbitrarily and dogmatically to exclude. It is only the exclusionists who are good in the 19th century are evil in the 20th century. Constantly we feel a merging away into infinitude, but that this book shall approximate to form, or that our data shall approximate to organization, or that we shall approximate to intelligibility, we have to call ourselves back constantly from wandering off into infinitude. The thing that we do, however, is to make our own outline, or the difference between what we include and what we exclude, vague. The crux here, and the limit beyond which we may not go very much, is acceptance that there is a region that we call the Super Sargasso Sea. Not yet fully accepted, but a provisional position that has received a great deal of support. But is it a part of this earth? And does it revolve with and over this earth? Or does it flatly overlie this earth, not revolving with and over this earth? That this earth does not revolve and is not round or roundish at all, but is continuous with the rest of its system, so that if one could break away from the traditions of the geographers, one might walk and come to Mars, and then find Mars continuous with Jupiter. I suppose someday such queries will sound absurd. The thing will be so obvious, because it is very difficult for me to conceive of little metallic objects hanging precisely over a small town in Russia for 4 months, if revolving unattached with a revolving earth. It may be that something aimed at that town and then later took another shot. These are speculations that seem to me to be evil relatively to these early years in the 20th century. Just now, I accept that this earth is not round, of course, that is very old-fashioned, but roundish, or at least that it has what is called form of its own, and does revolve upon its axis, and in an orbit around the sun. I only accept these old traditional notions. And that above it are regions of suspension that revolve with it, from which fall objects by disturbances of various kinds, and then later fall again in the same place. Monthly Weather Review, May 1884, 134. Report from the Signal Service observer at Bismarck, Dakota, that at 9 o'clock in the evening of May 22nd, 1884, sharp sounds were heard throughout the city, caused by a fall of flinty stones striking against windows. 15 hours later, another fall of flinty stones occurred at Bismarck. There is no report of stones having fallen anywhere else. This is a thing of the ultra-damned. All editors of scientific publications read the Monthly Weather Review, and frequently copy from it. The noise made by the stones of Bismarck rattling against those windows may be in a language that aviators will some day interpret, but it was a noise entirely surrounded by silences. Of this ultra-damned thing there is no mention, findable by me, in any other publication. The size of some hailstones has worried many meteorologists, but not textbook meteorologists. I know of no more serene occupation than that of writing textbooks, though writing for the war cry of the Salvation Army may be equally unadventurous. In the drowsy tranquility of a textbook, we easily and unintelligently read of dust particles around which icy rain forms, hailstones in their fall, then increasing by accretion. But in the meteorological journals, we read often of air spaces nucleating hailstones. But it's the size of the things. Dip a marble in icy water. Dip and dip and dip it. If you're a resolute dipper, you will, after a while, have an object the size of a baseball. But I think a thing could fall from the moon in that length of time. Also the strata of them. The Maryland hailstones are unusual, but a dozen strata have often been counted. Farrell gives an instance of 13 strata. Such considerations led Professor Schwedoff to argue that some hailstones are not and cannot be generated in this Earth's atmosphere, that they come from somewhere else. Now, in a relative existence, nothing can of itself be either attractive or repulsive. Its effects are functions of its associations or implications. Many of our data have been taken from very conservative scientific sources. It was not until their discordant implications or irreconcilabilities with the system were perceived that excommunication was pronounced against them. Professor Schwedoff's paper was read before the British Association, Report of 1882, page 453. The implication and the repulsiveness of the implication to the snug and tight little exclusionists of 1882, though we hold out that they were functioning well and ably relatively to 1882. That there is water, oceans or lakes and ponds, or rivers of it, that there is water away from, and yet not far remote from, this Earth's atmosphere and gravitation. The pain of it. That the snug little system of 1882 would be ousted from its reposefulness. A whole new science to learn. The science of supergeography. And science is a turtle that says that its own shell encloses all things. So the members of the British Association, to some of them, Professor Schwedoff's ideas were like slaps on the back of an environment. Denying turtle. To some of them, his heresy was like an offering of meat, raw and dripping, to milk-fed lambs. Some of them bleated like lambs, and some of them turtled like turtles. We used to crucify, but now we ridicule, or, in the loss of vigor of all progress, the spike has etherealized into the laugh. Sir William Thomson ridiculed the heresy with the phantomosities of his era, that all bodies, such as hailstones, if away from this Earth's atmosphere, would have to move at planetary velocity, which would be positively reasonable if the pronouncements of St. Isaac were anything but articles of faith, that a hailstone falling through this Earth's atmosphere with planetary velocity would perform 13,000 times as much work as would raise an equal weight of water 1 degree centigrade, and therefore never fall as a hailstone at all, be more than melted, super volatilized. These turls and these bleats of pedantry, though we insist that, relatively to 1882, these turls and bleats should be regarded as respectfully as we regard rag dolls that keep infants occupied and noiseless. It is the survival of rag dolls into maturity that we object to. So these pious and naive ones who believed that 13,000 times something could have, that is, in quasi-existence, an exact and calculable resultant, whereas there is, in quasi-existence, nothing that can, except by delusion and convenience, be called a unit in the first place, whose devotions to Saint Isaac required blind belief in formulas of falling bodies. Against data that were piling up in their own time of slow falling meteorites, milk-warm ones admitted, even by Farrington and Merrill, at least, one icy meteorite nowhere denied by the present orthodoxy a datum as accessible to Thomson in 1882 as it is now to us, because it was an occurrence of 1860. Beans and needles and tacks and a magnet. Needles and tacks adhere to and systematize relatively to a magnet. But if some beans, too, be caught up, they are irreconcilables to this system and drop right out of it. A member of the Salvation Army may hear over and over data that seem so memorable to an evolutionist. It seems remarkable that they do not influence him. One finds that he cannot remember them. It is incredible that Sir William Thomson had never heard of slow-falling, cold meteorites. It is simply that he had no power to remember such irreconcilabilities. And then Mr. Symons again. Mr. Symons was a man who probably did more for the science of meteorology than did any other man of his time. Therefore, he probably did more to hold back the science of meteorology than did any other man of his time. In Nature, 41/135, Mr. Symons says that Professor Schwedoff's ideas are very droll. I think that even more amusing is our own acceptance that, not very far above this Earth's surface, is a region that will be the subject of a whole new science, supergeography, with which we shall immortalize ourselves in the resentments of the schoolboys of the future. Pebbles and fragments of meteors and things from Mars and Jupiter and Azuria, wedges, delayed messages, cannonballs, bricks, nails, coal and coke and charcoal and offensive old cargoes. Things that coat in ice in some regions, and things that get into areas so warm that they putrefy, or that there are all the climates of geography in supergeography. I shall have to accept that, floating in the sky of this earth, there often are fields of ice as extensive as those on the Arctic Ocean, volumes of water in which are many fishes and frogs, tracts of land covered with caterpillars. Aviators of the future. They fly up and up. Then they get out and walk. The fishing's good. The bait's right there. They find messages from other worlds. And within 3 weeks, there's a big trade worked up in forged messages. Sometimes I shall write a guidebook to the Super Sargasso Sea for aviators, but just at present there wouldn't be much call for it. We now have more of our expression upon hail as a concomitant, or more data of things that have fallen from the sky with hail. In general, the expression is: these things may have been raised from some other part of the earth's surface, in whirlwinds, or may not have fallen, and may have been upon the ground in the first place. But were the hailstones found with them, raised from some other part of the earth's surface, or were the hailstones upon the ground in the first place? As I said before, this expression is meaningless. As to a few instances, it is reasonable to think of some coincidence between the fall of hail and the fall of other things. But, inasmuch as there have been a good many instances, we begin to suspect that this is not so much a book we're writing as a sanitarium for overworked coincidences. If not conceivably could very large hailstones and lumps of ice from in this earth's atmosphere, and so then had to come from external regions, then other things in or accompanying very large hailstones and lumps of ice came from external regions, which worries us a little. We may be instantly translated to the positive absolute. Cosmos 13/120 quotes a Virginia newspaper that fishes, said to have been catfishes, a foot long, some of them, had fallen in 1853 at Norfolk, Virginia, with hail. Vegetable debris, not only nuclear but frozen upon the surfaces of large hailstones at Toulouse, France, July 28, 1874. La Science pour tout, 1874-270. Description of a storm at Pontiac, Canada, July 11, 1864, in which it is said that it was not hailstones that fell, but pieces of ice from ½ an inch to over 2 inches in diameter. Canadian Naturalist, 2/1/308. But the most extraordinary thing is that a respectable farmer of undoubted veracity says he picked up a piece of hail or ice in the center of which was a small green frog. Storm at Dubuque, Iowa, June 16, 1882, in which fell hailstones and pieces of ice. Monthly Weather Review, June 1882. The foreman of the Novelty Iron Works of this city states that in 2 large hailstones melted by him were found small living frogs. But the pieces of ice that fell upon this occasion had a peculiarity that indicates, though by as bizarre an indication as any we've had yet, that they had been for a long time motionless or floating somewhere. We'll take that up soon. End of section 16. Recording by Patrick McAfee, Chicago, gis.depaul.edu/pmcAfee. Chapter 13 of The Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick McAfee. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 13b. Living age 52-186. That, June 30th, 1841, fishes, one of which was 10 inches long, fell at Boston. That, 8 days later, fishes and ice fell at Derby. In Timbs' Yearbook, 1842-275, it is said that at Derby the fishes had fallen in enormous numbers, from ½ an inch to 2 inches long, and some considerably larger. In the Athenaeum, 1841, 542, copied from the Sheffield Patriot. It is said that one of the fishes weighed 3 ounces. In several accounts it is said that with the fishes fell many small frogs and pieces of half-melted ice. We are told that the frogs and the fishes had been raised from some other part of the earth's surface in a whirlwind. No whirlwind specified, nothing said as to what part of the earth's surface comes ice in the month of July. Interests us that the ice is described as half melted. In the London Times, July 15, 1841, it is said that the fishes were sticklebacks, that they had fallen with ice and small frogs, many of which had survived the fall. We note that at Dunfermline, 3 months later, October 7, 1841, fell many fishes, several inches in length, in a thunderstorm. London Times, October 12, 1841. Hailstones we don't care so much about. The matter of stratification seems significant, but we think more of the fall of lumps of ice from the sky as possible data of the Super Sargasso Sea. Lumps of ice a foot in circumference. Derbyshire, England, May 12, 1811. Annual Register, 1811, 54. Cuboidal mass, 6 inches in diameter, that fell at Birmingham 26 days later. Thomson, Intro to Meteorology, page 179. Size of pumpkins. Bangalore, India, May 22, 1851. Report British Association, 1855, 35. Masses of ice of 1.5 pounds each. New Hampshire, August 13, 1851. Lummus, Meteorology, page 129. Masses of ice size of a man's head in the Delphos tornado. Farrell, Popular Treatise, page 428. Large as a man's hand, killing thousands of sheep. Texas, May 3, 1877. Monthly Weather Review, May, 1877. Pieces of ice so large that they could not be grasped in one hand. In a tornado, in Colorado, June 24, 1877. Monthly Weather Review, June, 1877. Lumps of ice 4.5 inches long. Richmond, England, August 2, 1879. Simon's Meteorological Magazine, 14/100. Mass of ice 21 inches in circumference that fell with hail, Iowa, June, 1881. Monthly Weather Review, June, 1881. Pieces of ice 8 inches long and 1.5 inches thick, Davenport, Iowa, August 30, 1882. Monthly Weather Review, August, 1882. Lump of ice size of a brick, weight 2 pounds, Chicago, July 12, 1883. Monthly Weather Review, July, 1883. Lumps of ice that weighed 1.5 pounds each. India, May, 1888. Nature, 37 through 42. Lump of ice weighing 4 pounds. Texas, December 6, 1893. Scientific American, 68/58. Lumps of ice 1 pound in weight. November 14, 1901. In a tornado, Victoria. Meteorology of Australia, page 34. Of course, it is our acceptance that these masses not only accompanied tornadoes, but were brought down to this earth by tornadoes. Flammarion, the atmosphere, page 34. Block of ice weighing 4.5 pounds that fell at Cazorta, Spain, June 15, 1829. Block of ice weighing 11 pounds at Sète, France, October 1844. Mass of ice 3 feet long, 3 feet wide, and more than 2 feet thick that fell in a storm in Hungary, May 8, 1802. Scientific American, 47, 119. That, according to the Salina Journal, a mass of ice weighing about 80 pounds had fallen from the sky near Salina, Kansas, August 1882. We are told that Mr. W.J. Hagler, the North Santa Fe merchant, became possessor of it and packed it in sawdust in his store. London Times, April 7th, 1860. That upon the 16th of March, 1860, in a snowstorm in Upper Wasdale, blocks of ice so large that at a distance they looked like a flock of sheep had fallen. Report of the British Association, 1851, 32. That a mass of ice about a cubic yard in size had fallen at Khandish, India, 1828. Against these data, though, so far as I know, so many of them have never been assembled together before, there is a silence upon the part of scientific men that is unusual. Our Super Sargasso Sea may not be an unavoidable conclusion, but arrival upon this earth of ice from external regions does seem to be, except that there must be it ever so faint, a merger. It is in the notion that these masses of ice are only congealed hailstones. We have data against this notion, as applied to all our instances, but the explanation has been offered, and it seems to me may apply in some instances. In the Bulletin Société Astronomique de France, 245, it is said of blocks of ice the size of decanters that had fallen at Tunis that they were only masses of congealed hailstones. London Times, August 4th, 1857. That a block of ice described as pure ice, weighing 25 pounds, had been found in the meadow of Mr. Warner of Cricklewood. There had been a storm the day before. As in some of our other instances, no one had seen this object fall from the sky. It was found after the storm. That's all that can be said about it. Letter from Captain Blackiston, communicated by General Sabine to the Royal Society. London, Royal Society Proceedings, 10/468. That, January 14th, 1860, in a thunderstorm, pieces of ice had fallen upon Captain Blackiston's vessel. That it was not hail. It was not hail, but irregular shaped pieces of solid ice, of different dimensions, up to the size of half a brick. According to the Advertiser Scotsman, quoted by the Edinburgh New Philosophical Magazine, 47/371, an irregular shaped mass of ice fell at Ord, Scotland, August 1849, after an extraordinary peal of thunder. It is said that this was homogeneous ice, except in a small part, which looked like congealed hailstones. The mass was about 20 feet in circumference. The story, as told in the London Times, August 14th, 1849, is that, upon the evening of the 13th of August, 1849, after a loud peal of thunder, a mass of ice, said to have been 20 feet in circumference, had fallen upon the estate of Mr. Moffat, of Balvullich, Rossshire. It is said that this object fell alone or without hailstones. Altogether, though, it is not so strong for the Super Sargasso Sea, I think. This is one of our best expressions upon external origins. That large blocks of ice could form in the moisture of this Earth's atmosphere is about as likely as that blocks of stone could form in a dust whirl. Of course, if ice or water comes to this Earth from external sources, we think of at least minute organisms in it, and on, with our data, to frogs, fishes, on to anything that's thinkable, coming from external sources. It's of great importance to us to accept that large lumps of ice have fallen from the sky, but what we desire most, perhaps because of our interest in its archaeologic and paleontologic treasures, is now to be through with tentativeness and probation, and to take the Super Sargasso Sea into full acceptance in our more advanced fold of the chosen of this 20th century. In the report of the British Association, 1855-37, it is said that at Purundur, India, December 11, 1854, flat pieces of ice, many of them weighing several pounds each, I suppose, had fallen from the sky. They are described as large ice flakes. Vast fields of ice in the superarctic regions, or strata, of the Super Sargasso Sea. When they break up, their fragments are flake-like. In our acceptance, there are aerial ice fields that are remote from this Earth, that break up, fragments grinding against one another, rolling in vapor and water of different constituency in different regions, forming slowly as stratified hailstones, but that there are ice fields near this Earth that break up into just such flat pieces of ice as cover any pond or river when ice of a pond or river is broken, and are sometimes soon precipitated to the Earth in this familiar flat formation. Simon's Meteorological Magazine, 43 154. A correspondent writes that at Braemar, July 2, 1908, when the sky was clear overhead and the sun shining, flat pieces of ice fell from somewhere. The sun was shining, but something was going on somewhere. Thunder was heard. Until I saw the reproduction of a photograph in the Scientific American, February 21, 1914, I had supposed that these ice fields must be, say, at least 10 or 20 miles away from this Earth, and invisible to terrestrial observers, except as the blurs that have so often been reported by astronomers and meteorologists. The photograph published by the Scientific American is of an aggregation supposed to be clouds, presumably not very high. So clearly detailed are they. The writer says that they looked to him like a field of broken ice. Beneath is a picture of a conventional field of ice, floating ordinarily in water. The resemblance between the two pictures is striking. Nevertheless, it seems to me incredible that the first of the photographs could be of an aerial ice field, or that gravitation could cease to act at only a mile or so from this Earth's surface, unless the exceptional, the flux and vagary of all things, or that normally this Earth's gravitation extends, say, 10 or 15 miles outward, but that gravitation must be rhythmic. Of course, in the pseudo-formulas of astronomers, gravitation as a fixed quantity is essential. Accept that gravitation is a variable force, and astronomers deflate, with a perceptible hissing sound, into the punctured condition of economists, biologists, meteorologists, and all the others of the humbler divinities, who can admittedly offer only insecure approximations. We refer all who would not like to hear the hiss of escaping arrogance to Herbert Spencer's chapters upon the rhythm of all phenomena. If everything else, light from the stars, heat from the sun, the winds and the tides, forms and colors and sizes of animals, demands and supplies and prices, political opinions and chemic reactions, and religious doctrines and magnetic intensities, and the ticking of clocks, and arrival and departure of the seasons, if everything else is variable, we accept that the notion of gravitation as fixed and formulable is only another attempted positivism, doomed, like all other illusions of realness, in quasi-existence. So it is intermediatism to accept that, though gravitation may approximate higher to invariability than do the winds, for instance, it must be somewhere between the absolutes of stability and instability. Here, then, we are not much impressed with the opposition of physicists and astronomers, fearing a little mournfully that their language is of expiring sibilations. So then the fields of ice in the sky, and that, though usually so far away as to be mere blurs, at times they come close enough to be seen in detail. For description of what I call a blur, see Popular Science News, February 1884. Sky, in general, unusually clear, but near the sun, a white, slightly curdled haze, which was dazzlingly bright. We accept that sometimes fields of ice pass between the sun and the earth, that many strata of ice, or very thick fields of ice, or superimposed fields, would obscure the sun, that there have been occasions when the sun was eclipsed by fields of ice. Flammarion, The Atmosphere, page 394. That a profound darkness came upon the city of Brussels, June 18, 1839. There fell flat pieces of ice an inch long. Intense darkness at Aitkin, Minnesota, April 2nd, 1889. Sand and solid chunks of ice reported to have fallen. Science, April 19th, 1889. In Simon's Meteorological Magazine, 32-172, are outlined rough-edged but smooth-surfaced pieces of ice that fell at Manassas, Virginia, August 10, 1897. They look as much like the roughly broken fragments of a smooth sheet of ice as ever have roughly broken fragments of a smooth sheet of ice looked. About 2 inches across and 1 inch thick. In Cosmos 3-116, it is said that at Rouen, July 5th, 1853, fell irregular shaped pieces of ice about the size of a hand, described as looking as if all had been broken from one enormous block of ice. That, I think, was an aerial iceberg. In the awful density, or almost absolute stupidity, of the 19th century, it never occurred to anybody to look for traces of polar bears or of seals upon these fragments. Of course, seeing what we want to see, having been able to gather these data only because they are in agreement with notions formed in advance, we are not so respectful to our own notions as to a similar impression forced upon an observer who had no theory or acceptance to support. In general, our prejudices see and our prejudices investigate, but this should not be taken as an absolute. Monthly Weather Review, July 1894. That, from the Weather Bureau of Portland, Oregon, a tornado of June 3rd, 1894 was reported. fragments of ice fell from the sky. They averaged 3 to 4 inches square and about an inch thick. In length and breadth, they had the smooth surfaces required by our acceptance, and, according to the writer in the review, gave the impression of a vast field of ice suspended in the atmosphere and suddenly broken into fragments about the size of the palm of the hand. This datum, profoundly of what we used to call the damned, or before we could no longer accept judgment, or cut and dried condemnation by infants, turtles, and lambs, was copied, but without comment, in the Scientific American, 71, 371. Our theology is something like this. Of course we ought to be damned, but we revolt against adjudication by infants, turtles, and lambs. So now come to some remarkable data in a rather difficult department of supergeography. Vast fields of aerial ice. There's a lesson to me in the treachery of the imaginable. Most of our opposition is in the clearness with which the conventional, but impossible, becomes the imaginable, and then the resistant to modifications. After it had become the conventional with me, I conceived clearly of vast sheets of ice, a few miles above this earth, then the shining of the sun, and the ice partly melting, that note upon the ice that fell at Derby, water trickling and forming icicles upon the lower surface of the ice sheet. I seemed to look up and so clearly visualized those icicles, hanging like stalactites from a flat-roofed cave in white calcite. Or I looked up at the underside of an aerial ice lump and seemed to see a papillation, similar to that observed by a calf at times. But then, if icicles should form upon the underside of a sheet of aerial ice, that would be by the falling of water toward this earth. An icicle is of course an expression of gravitation, and if water melting from ice should fall toward this earth, why not the ice itself fall before an icicle could have time to form? Of course, in quasi-existence, where everything is a paradox, one might argue that the water falls but the ice does not, because the ice is heavier, that is, in masses. That notion, I think, belongs in a more advanced course than we are taking at present. Our expression upon icicles. A vast field of aerial ice. It is inert to this earth's gravitation, but by universal flux and variation, part of it sags closer to this earth, and is susceptible to gravitation. By cohesion with the main mass, this part does not fall, but water melting from it does fall and forms icicles. Then, by various disturbances, this part sometimes falls in fragments that are protrusive with icicles. Of the ice that fell, some of it enclosing living frogs at Dubuque, Iowa, June 16, 1882, it is said, Monthly Weather Review, June 1882, that there were pieces from 1 to 17 inches in circumference, the largest weighing 1 pound and 3/4, that upon some of them were icicles half an inch in length. We emphasize that these objects were not hailstones. The only merger is that of knobby hailstones, or of large hailstones, with protuberances wrought by crystallization. But that is no merger with terrestrial phenomena, and such formations are unaccountable to orthodoxy, or it is incredible that hail could so crystallize, not forming by accretion, in the fall of a few seconds. For an account of such hailstones, see Nature, 61, 594. Note the size. Some of them the size of turkeys' eggs. It is our expression that sometimes the icicles themselves have fallen, as if by concussion, or as if something had swept against the underside of an aerial ice floe, detaching its papillations. Monthly Weather Review, June, 1889. That, at Oswego, New York, June 11th, 1889, according to the Turin, New York, Leader, there fell, in a thunderstorm, pieces of ice that resembled the fragments of icicles. Monthly Weather Review, 29/506. That, on Florence Island, St. Lawrence River, August 8, 1901, with ordinary hail, fell pieces of ice formed like icicles, the size and shape of lead pencils, that had been cut into sections about 3/8 of an inch in length. So our data of the Super Sargasso Sea and its Arctic region, and, for weeks at a time, an ice field, may hang motionless over a part of this earth's surface. The sun has some effect upon it, but not much until late in the afternoon, I should say. Part of it has sagged, but is held up by cohesion with the main mass, whereupon we have such an occurrence, as would have been a little uncanny to us once upon a time, or fall of water from a cloudless sky, day after day, in one small part of this earth's surface, late in the afternoon, when the sun's rays had had time for their effects. Monthly Weather Review, October, 1886. That, according to the Charlotte Chronicle, October 21st, 1886, for 3 weeks there had been a fall of water from the sky in Charlotte, North Carolina, localized in one particular spot, every afternoon about 3 o'clock, that, whether the sky was cloudy or cloudless, the water or rain fell upon a small patch of land between 2 trees, and nowhere else. This is the newspaper account, and, as such, it seems in the depths of the unchosen, either by me or any other expression of the Salvation Army. The account by the Signal Service observer at Charlotte, published in the Review, follows: an unusual phenomenon was witnessed on the 21st, having been informed that for some weeks prior to date rain had been falling daily after 3 p.m. on a particular spot near 2 trees, corner of 9th and D streets. I visited the place and saw precipitation in the form of raindrops at 4:47 and 4:55 p.m., while the sun was shining brightly. On the 22nd, I again visited the place, and from 4:05 to 4:25 p.m., a light shower of rain fell from a cloudless sky. Sometimes the precipitation falls over an area of half an acre, but always appears to center at these 2 trees, and when lightest occurs there only. End of chapter 13. Recording by Patrick McAfee. Chicago, gis.depaul.edu/pmcAfee. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort, Chapter 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick McAfee. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort, Chapter 14a. We see conventionally. It is not only that we think and act and speak and dress alike because of our surrender to social attempt at entity, in which we are only supercellular. We see what it is proper, that we should see. It is orthodox enough to say that a horse is not a horse to an infant, any more than is an orange to the unsophisticated. It's interesting to walk along a street sometimes and look at things and wonder what they'd look like if we hadn't been taught to see horses and trees and houses as horses and trees and houses. I think that to supersight, they are local stresses merging indistinguishably into one another in an all-inclusive nexus. I think that it would be credible enough to say that many times have Monstrator and Elvera and Azuria crossed telescopic fields of vision, and were not even seen, because it wouldn't be proper to see them. It wouldn't be respectable. And it wouldn't be respectful, it would be insulting to old bones to see them. It would bring on evil influences from the relics of St. Isaac to see them. But our data of vast worlds that are orbitless, or that are navigable, or that are adrift in interplanetary tides and currents, the data that we shall have of their approach in modern times within 5 or 6 miles of this earth. But then their visits or approaches to other planets, or to other of the few regularized bodies that have surrendered to the attempted entity of this solar system as a whole. The question that we can't very well evade: have these other worlds or superconstructions ever been seen by astronomers? I think there would not be much approximation to realness in taking refuge in the notion of astronomers who stare and squint and see only that which it is respectable and respectful to see. It is all very well to say that astronomers are hypnotics, and that an astronomer looking at the moon is hypnotized by the moon, but our acceptance is that the bodies of this present expression often visit the moon, or cross it, or are held in temporary suspension near it. Then some of them must often have been within the diameter of an astronomer's hypnosis. Our general expression, that upon the oceans of this earth there are regularized vessels, but also that there are tramp vessels, that upon the superocean there are regularized planets, but also that there are tramp worlds, that astronomers are like mercantile purists who would deny commercial vagabondage. Our acceptance is that vast celestial vagabonds have been excluded by astronomers, primarily because their irresponsibilities are an affront to the pure and the precise, or to attempted positivism, and secondarily because they have not been seen so very often. The planets steadily reflect the light of the sun. Upon this uniformity, a system that we call primary astronomy has been built up. But now the subject matter of advanced astronomy is data of celestial phenomena that are sometimes light and sometimes dark, varying like some of the satellites of Jupiter, but with a wider range. However, light or dark, they have been seen and reported so often that the only important reason for their exclusion is that they don't fit in. With dark bodies that are probably external to our own solar system, I have, in the provincialism that no one can escape, not much concern. Dark bodies afloat in outer space would have been damned a few years ago, but now they're sanctioned by Professor Barnard, and if he says they're all right, you may think of them without the fear of doing something wrong or ridiculous, the close kinship we note so often between the evil and the absurd. I suppose by the ridiculous I mean the froth of evil, the dark companion of Algol, for instance. Though that's a clear case of celestial miscegenation, the purists or positivists admit that's so. In the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, 1915, 394, Professor Barnard writes of an object. He calls it an object in Cephas. His idea is that there are dark, opaque bodies outside this solar system. But in the Astrophysical Journal, 1916, 1, he modifies into regarding them as dark nebulae. That's not so interesting. We accept that Venus, for instance, has often been visited by other worlds, or by superconstructions, from which come cinders and coke and coal, that sometimes these things have reflected light, and have been seen from this earth, by professional astronomers. It will be noted that throughout this chapter our data are accursed Brahmins, as by hypnosis and inertia we keep on and keep on saying, just as a good many of the scientists of the 19th century kept on and kept on admitting the power of the system that preceded them, or continuity would be smashed. There's a big chance here for us to be instantaneously translated to the positive absolute. Oh well. What I emphasize here is that our damned data are observations by astronomers of the highest standing, excommunicated by astronomers of similar standing, but backed up by the dominant spirit of their era, to which all minds had to equilibrate, or be negligible, unheard, submerged. It would seem sometimes in this book as if our revolts were against the dogmatisms and pontifications of single scientists of eminence. This is only a convenience because it seems necessary to personify. If we look over philosophical transactions, or the publications of the Royal Astronomical Society, for instance, we see that Herschel, for instance, was as powerless as any boy stargazer to enforce acceptance of any observation of his that did not harmonize with the system that was growing up as independently of him and all other astronomers as a phase in the development of an embryo compels all cells to take on appearances concordantly with the design and the predetermined progress and schedule of the whole. Visitors to Venus. Evans, Ways of the Planets, page 140. That, in 1645, a body large enough to look like a satellite was seen near Venus. 4 times in the first half of the 18th century, a similar observation was reported. The last report occurred in 1767. A large body has been seen 7 times, according to Science Gossip, 1886, 178, near Venus. At least one astronomer, Houzeau, accepted these observations and named the world planet superconstruction Neith. His views are mentioned, in passing but without endorsement, in the Transactions of the New York Academy, 5/249. Houzeau, or someone writing for the magazine section of a Sunday newspaper, outer darkness for both alike. A new satellite in this solar system might be a little disturbing, though the formulas of Laplace, which were considered final in his day, have survived the admittance of 500 or 600 bodies not included in those formulas. A satellite to Venus might be a little disturbing, but would be explained. But a large body approaching a planet, staying a while, going away, coming back some other time, anchoring, as it were. Azuria is pretty bad, but Azuria is no worse than Neith. Astrophysical Journal, 1/127. A light reflecting body or a bright spot near Mars, seen November 25th, 1894, by Professor Pickering and others at the Lowell Observatory, above an illuminated part of Mars, self-luminous it would seem, thought to have been a cloud, but estimated to have been about 20 miles away from the planet. Luminous spot seen moving across the disk of Mercury in 1799 by Harding and Schroeter. Monthly Notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, 38/338. In the first bulletin issued by the Lowell Observatory in 1903, Professor Lowell describes a body that was seen on the terminator of Mars, May 20th, 1903. On May 27th, it was suspected, if still there, it had moved, we are told, about 300 miles, probably a dust cloud. Very conspicuous and brilliant spots seen on the disk of Mars, October and November 1911. Popular Astronomy, Volume 19, Number 10. So one of them accepted 6 or 7 observations that were in agreement, except that they could not be regularized upon a world, planet, satellite, and he gave it a name. He named it Neith, Monstrator and Elvera, and Azuria and Super Romanimus, or heresy and orthodoxy, and the oneness of all quasiness, and our ways and means and methods are the very same. Or, if we name things that may not be, we are not of lonely guilt in the nomenclature of absences. But now, Leverrier and Vulcan. Leverrier again. Or, to demonstrate the collapsibility of a froth, stick a pin in the largest bubble of it. Astronomy and inflation. And by inflation we mean expansion of the attenuated. Or that the science of astronomy is a phantom film, distended with myth, stuff, but always our acceptance that it approximates higher to substantiality than did the system that preceded it. So Leverrier and the planet Vulcan. And we repeat, and it will do us small good to repeat, if you be of the masses that the astronomers have hypnotized, being themselves hypnotized, or they could not hypnotize others, or that the hypnotist's control is not the masterful power that it is popularly supposed to be, but only the transference of state from one hypnotic to another. If you be of the masses that the astronomers have hypnotized, you will not be able even to remember 10 pages from here, and Leverrier and the planet Vulcan will have fallen from your mind like beans from a magnet, or like data of cold meteorites from the mind of a Thomson. Leverrier and the planet Vulcan. And much the good it will do us to repeat. But at least temporarily we shall have an impression of a historic fiasco, such as, in our acceptance, could occur only in a quasi-existence. In 1859, Dr. Lescarbault, an amateur astronomer of Orgères, France, announced that upon March 26th of that year he had seen a body of planetary size cross the sun. We are in a subject that is now as unholy to the present system as ever were its own subjects to the system that preceded it, or as ever were slanders against miracles to the preceding system. Nevertheless, few textbooks go so far as quite to disregard this tragedy. The method of the systematists is slightingly to give a few instances of the unholy and dispose of the few. If it were desirable to them to deny that there are mountains upon this earth, they would record a few observations upon some slight eminences near Orange, New Jersey, but say that commuters, though estimable persons in several ways, are likely to have their observations mixed. The textbooks casually mention a few of the supposed observations upon Vulcan and then pass on. Dr. Lescarbault wrote to Leverrier, who hastened to Orgères. Because this announcement assimilated with his own calculations upon a planet between Mercury and the Sun. Because this solar system itself has never attained positiveness in the aspect of regularity, there are to Mercury, as there are to Neptune, phenomena irreconcilable with the formulas, or motions that betray influence by something else. We are told that Leverrier satisfied himself as to the substantial accuracy of the reported observation. The story of this investigation is told in Monthly Notices, 2098. It seems too bad to threaten the naive little thing with our rude sophistications, but it is amusingly of the ingenuousness of the age from which present dogmas have survived. Lescarbot wrote to Leverrier. Leverrier hastened to Orgères, but he was careful not to tell Lescarbot who he was. Went right in and subjected Dr. Lescarbot to a very severe cross-examination, just the way you or I may feel at liberty to go into anybody's home and be severe with people, pressing him hard step by step, just as anyone might go into someone else's house and press him hard, though unknown to the hard-pressed one. Not until he was satisfied did Leverrier reveal his identity. I suppose Dr. Lescarbot expressed astonishment. I think there's something utopian about this. It's so unlike the standoffishness of New York life. Leverrier gave the name Vulcan to the object that Dr. Lescarbot had reported. By the same means by which he is, even to this day, supposed by the faithful to have discovered Neptune, he had already announced the probable existence of an intra-mercurial body, or group of bodies. He had 5 observations besides Lescarbot's upon something that had been seen to cross the sun. In accordance with the mathematical hypnoses of his era, he studied these 6 transits. Out of them he computed elements giving Vulcan a period of about 20 days, or a formula for heliocentric longitude at any time. But he placed the time of best observation away up in 1877. But even so, or considering that he still had probably a good many years to live, it may strike one that he was a little rash. That is, if one has not gone very deep into the study of hypnoses, that, having discovered Neptune by a method which, in our acceptance, had no more to recommend it than had one equally well thought of methods of witch-finding, he should have taken such chances that if he was right as to Neptune, but should be wrong as to Vulcan, his average would be away below that of most fortune-tellers, who could scarcely hope to do business upon a 50% basis, all that the reasoning of a tyro in hypnoses. The date, March 22nd, 1877. The scientific world was up on its hind legs nosing the sky. The thing had been done so authoritatively. Never a pope had said a thing with more of the seeming of finality. If 6 observations correlated, what more could be asked? The editor of Nature, a week before the predicted event, though cautious, said it is difficult to explain how 6 observers, unknown to one another, could have data that could be formulated if they were not related phenomena. In a way, at this point occurs the crisis of our whole book. Formulas are against us. But can astronomic formulas, backed up by observations in agreement, taken many years apart, calculated by a Leverrier, be as meaningless, in a positive sense, as all other quasi-things that we have encountered so far? The preparations they made before March 22nd, 1877. In England, the Astronomer Royal made it the expectation of his life, notified observers at Madras, Melbourne, Sydney, and New Zealand, and arranged with observers in Chile and the United States. M. Struve had prepared for observations in Siberia and Japan. March 22nd, 1877. Not absolutely hypocritically, I think it's pathetic, myself. If anyone should doubt the sincerity of Leverrier in this matter, we note, whether it has meaning or not, that a few months later he died. I think we'll take up Monstrator, though there's so much to this subject that we'll have to come back. According to the Annual Register, 9/120, Upon the 9th of August, 1762, M. de Rostan, of Basel, France, was taking altitudes of the sun, at Lausanne. He saw a vast spindle-shaped body, about 3 of the sun's digits in breadth, and 9 in length, advancing slowly across the disk of the sun, or at no more than half the velocity with which the ordinary solar spots move. It did not disappear until the 7th of September, when it reached the sun's limb. Because of the spindle-like form, I incline to think of a super zeppelin. But another observation, which seems to indicate that it was a world, is that though it was opaque and eclipsed the sun, it had around it a kind of nebulosity, or atmosphere. A penumbra would ordinarily be a datum of a sunspot, but there are observations that indicate that this object was at a considerable distance from the sun. It is recorded that another observer at Paris, watching the sun at this time, had not seen this object, but that M. Croste at Seoul, about 45 German leagues northward from Lausanne, had seen it, describing the same spindle form, but disagreeing a little as to breadth. Then comes the important point that he and M. de Rostan did not see it upon the same part of the sun. This, then, is parallax, and compounded with invisibility at Paris is great parallax, or that, in the course of a month, in the summer of 1762, a large, opaque, spindle-shaped body traversed the disk of the sun, but at a great distance from the sun. The writer in the Register says, "In a word, we know of nothing to have recourse to in the heavens by which to explain this phenomenon." I suppose he was not a hopeless addict to explaining. Extraordinary! We fear he must have been a man of loose habits in some other respects. As to us, Monstrator. In the monthly notes of the Royal Astronomical Society, February, 1877, Leverrier, who never lost faith up to the last day, gives the 6 observations upon an unknown body of planetary size that he had formulated. Fritsche, October 10th, 1802. Stark, October 9th, 1819. De Cuppy, October 30th, 1839. Sidebottom, November 12th, 1849. L'Escarbot, March 26th, 1859. Lumi, March 20th, 1862. If we weren't so accustomed to science in its essential aspect of disregard, we'd be mystified and impressed, like the editor of Nature, with the formulation of these data agreement of so many instances would seem incredible as a coincidence, but our acceptance is that, with just enough disregard, astronomers and fortune-tellers can formulate anything, or we'd engage ourselves to formulate periodicities in the crowds in Broadway. Say that every Wednesday morning a tall man with one leg and a black eye, carrying a rubber plant, passes the Singer Building at 10:15 o'clock. Of course it couldn't really be done unless such a man did have such periodicity, but if some Wednesday mornings it should be a small child lugging a barrel, or a fat negress with a week's wash, by ordinary disregard that would be prediction good enough for the kind of quasi-existence we're in. So whether we accuse, or whether we think that the word accuse over-dignifies an attitude toward a quasi-astronomer, or mere figment in a super-dream, our acceptance is that Leverrier never did formulate observations. That he picked out observations that could be formulated. That of this type are all formulas. That if Leverrier had not been himself helplessly hypnotized, or if he had had in him more than a tincture of realness, Never could he have been beguiled by such a quasi-process, but that he was hypnotized, and so extended or transferred his condition to others, that upon March 22nd, 1877, he had this earth bristling with telescopes, with the rigid and almost inanimate forms of astronomers behind them, and not a blessed thing of any unusuality was seen upon that day or succeeding days. But that the science of astronomy suffered the slightest in prestige? It couldn't. The spirit of 1877 was behind it. If, in an embryo, some cells should not live up to the phenomena of their era, the others will sustain the scheduled appearances. Not until an embryo enters the mammalian stage are cells of the reptilian stage false cells. It is our acceptance that there were many equally authentic reports upon large planetary bodies that had been seen near the sun, that of many Leverrier picked out 6, not then deciding that all the other observations related to still other large planetary bodies, but arbitrarily or hypnotically disregarding, or heroically disregarding, every one of them, that to formulate at all he had to exclude falsely. The denouement killed him, I think. I'm not at all inclined to place him with the Greys and Hitchcocks and Simonses. I'm not, because though it was rather unsportsmanlike to put the date so far ahead, he did give a date, and he did stick to it with such a high approximation. I think Leverrier was translated to the positive absolute. The disregarded. Observation of July 26, 1819, by Gruthinson. But that was of 2 bodies that crossed the sun together. End of chapter 14a. Recording by Patrick McAfee, Chicago, gis.depaul.edu/pmcafee.